Welcome everyone to the Get Involved Collaboratives Volunteer Match webinar. We are excited to have Jennifer Bennett from the Volunteer Match join us to provide some great ideas about creative and innovative recognition strategies for today's volunteer. I'm going to give her presenter rights now. So she can progress her slides and take it away, Jennifer.
Great. Thank you, Donna. Can you see my slides?
I have your slides uploaded to the webinar.
Okay, I'm just seeing, let's see. I'm just seeing your, your initials.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Is anyone else able to see the slides?
Yes, I can see the slides from Janet.
Okay, great. Well, I'm not sure why I can't.
Okay. Well, I'll be happy to make them go forward for you if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's interesting. Some of you are seeing just initials, and some of them are seeing my screen.
Okay. It would be great if everybody could see the slides. I don't know if I can share my screen. I can certainly pull my slides up on my end.
Yeah, why don't you try that and see if that will work?
Sorry, we're not. Let's see here. I should have done this before. I know you'd sent something saying you were having some trouble with this, but let me just quickly pull these up. So anyway, I can at least talk about what we're going to talk about while we're trying to get the slides situated. The goal here today is to really talk about, we spent a lot of time these last couple of years thinking about a culture of volunteer engagement, thinking about creating mission-driven volunteer opportunities. And the goal here is to really make sure that our recognition strategies come along with us. And we want to make sure that we have that opportunity. Let's see. I think I'm having a little bit of trouble here. There we go. We want to make sure those recognition strategies come along with us, right? We don't want to continue to do traditional or old school recognition that is out of alignment with what our volunteers expect from us or what our volunteers want to get out of their volunteer engagement with us. All right. So let me get these slides up. Sorry, everybody.
I know, this is so odd because in the comments, about half of the people can see the slide and half of the people cannot.
That's so strange, and I'm not sure. I'm super not familiar with WebEx, so I don't know exactly if there's something I need to do or if there's something. Let's see. I don't seem to have. It looks like can I reclaim the host role? Is that what I'm supposed to do? Because I don't.
Yeah, try that, or reclaim the presenter role. You should be presenter right now.
I'm not. Gosh, let's see. Okay, it looks like I'm the presenter, but you guys aren't seeing my screen, and it doesn't seem to be giving me a button.
I'm gonna try to share my application. So.
Okay. Audio's fine, no slides. All right, well, while Dawn is doing that, I can try to sort of set our stage. What we're going to talk about today is really thinking about what kinds of recognition strategies match the motivation and match the sort of goals of our volunteers. So as I mentioned, we do want to make sure that we're basing that sort of in our culture and our values. And remember, culture is made up of our goals, values, and beliefs around volunteer engagement. So we're going to spend some time thinking about what might be meaningful for our volunteers. We're also going to talk a little bit, some of you may be in an hours counting culture where you have volunteers that really are sort of racking up those hours. They might have been with you for a while. They might be working towards a number goal. So we're going to talk a little bit about what to do about that. We don't just want to pull that out from underneath our volunteers. Especially if we have some volunteers who've been with us for a long time that have sort of invested in that. And we may still have volunteers that want to track their hours or want to count their hours, or maybe need to count their hours for service learning or community service volunteers. So we don't want to just throw that all away, but current recognition strategies can have so much more impact and meaning when we do tie it to that motivation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we're going to talk about what to do. How do we start to do that? How do we start to implement that kind of recognition strategy into the work that we're already doing? I'm still seeing just the initials, so I can keep going.
How's that for everyone?
We can see the slides. If you want to make it big, maybe that would, yeah, there we go. That looks.
Okay. Now let's see if I can advance. There we go. Okay, so I will advance them for you if that will work for you, Jennifer.
Yeah, that does, absolutely.
All right.
So this is sort of what we've talked about today already. So if you want to go to the next slide, we'll just jump into the content. Okay, so a lot of us know, right, we're supposed to recognize our volunteers, and we're going to talk today a little bit about how we can create sort of those in-the-minute thank yous and celebrating small wins or milestones within teams or within departments. And we're going to also talk about sort of that bigger recognition in front of all volunteers or in front of, with the library or also with our community. At Volunteer Match, we know sort of what motivates volunteers to go out and volunteer. They want to find that cause that they care about, and they want to make a difference in their community. And I know there's some additional information you guys have just from from the libraries when you send out those surveys that really echoes this, that they, you know, sort of become those advocates for the work that they're doing. So we want to make sure that when we're thinking about recognition, we're thinking about that motivation. And I know some of you may also have those conversations with volunteers when they join your library about what they want to do, how they want to help, how they want to get involved. Do they want to use their skills? What do they want to accomplish with their volunteer time? So we want to make sure that we're thinking about that when we're thinking about recognition. As I said, there may be some volunteers that do need to or want to track their hours, but very rarely do you find a volunteer whose only motivation is to sort of rack up those hours. So when we do talk about, you've given us this many hours, it may not resonate with a volunteer as much as when we can really let them know how they've helped our cause or how they've made a difference in their community. All right, next slide, please. As I mentioned when we were getting started, sort of understanding why those volunteers are coming to us, what do they want to accomplish, and as I mentioned as well, wanting to make sure that we are matching that motivation with the recognition, so that you said you wanted to come in and have this kind of an impact or interact with these types of patrons or make this type of a difference in your library. Here's how you've done it. And when we do think about sort of the size and scope of our volunteer engagement initiatives or the work that we do, obviously this might start to feel overwhelming if we have dozens or hundreds of volunteers. It's hard to sort of keep track of all of these things individually, but we can start to think about themes or trends that we hear from our volunteers. We want to make sure that we are sort of echoing back what they want to accomplish with us, and that we're giving them the sort of recognition that matches up with what they want to accomplish and what matters to them. So really making sure that we're thinking about that motivation. All right, next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about hours counting, and again, I know that this can be something that really does sort of seep into our sort of culture of volunteer engagement, that there can be volunteers who are still with us looking for those hour-based awards. But the thing about sort of traditional recognition, especially around things that are seasonal or annual, those hours counting, the thank you gifts that are based on longevity, it doesn't necessarily catch all of those volunteers who are coming to us and working with us in sort of a more modern volunteer engagement strategy. There's an organization that's international that all of you have heard of that I'm not going to put on the spot and name, but a couple of years ago they had a real crisis in their recognition strategy because everything was based on that anniversary date. So after 366 days, they recognized the work that volunteers were doing with their organization. But they looked at sort of the modern volunteer engagement that they were doing, the current volunteer engagement that they were doing, and realized that they had volunteers that were coming in to do single-day events, volunteers that were working on projects, volunteers that were bringing their professional level skills with them, that weren't getting caught in that, here's your, you know, happy anniversary, here's your card, and a thank you, because the way volunteering works isn't necessarily based on longevity anymore. Now, we do still have some of those volunteers. As I mentioned, if you are counting hours, and if you have volunteers that are interested in counting their hours, we don't want to throw that away. And we'll talk about that a little bit. They've invested all of that time literally into that, and it can be very valuable and important to some of our longer term volunteers. But we want to make sure that we are, as I said, matching those individual motivations, that we're thinking about how we actually engage volunteers now, how they interact with us, what kinds of sort of tenure they serve with us, whether that's a day during, you know, a book sale weekend, whether that's you know, a project that they come in and do over a couple of weeks or a couple of months, or those volunteers who do still come to us with an ongoing sort of regular volunteer interaction, making sure that they are getting that sort of recognition, again, that's tied back to impact. And again, if we think of our culture, if we think about what we say is important about volunteers, about the work that they do with us, it's probably not just that free labor, right? We value them as community members, we value them as experts, we value their passion and the purpose that they bring to the library, and we want to make sure that we're echoing that back with sort of a more modern approach to recognition. All right, next slide, please. So, what matters to your library and what matters to your volunteers? I know it's been a while, but I know we've talked about culture within the library. Again, thinking about those goals, values, and beliefs that drive volunteer engagement. And sometimes we have a culture that does a really good job, right? A culture that understands the value that volunteers bring, understands that volunteers are not just free labor, understands that volunteers come with their own sort of motivations and passions, and we do a good job of integrating those volunteers with paid staff and celebrating their work. Sometimes we have a culture that might be a little bit ignorant in a way that they haven't been educated yet of what volunteers do, of the value that they bring. And then also sometimes we do have a culture that unfortunately can be sort of dismissive or can sideline the work of volunteers. So when we think about what we want our culture to look like or feel like, what those goals and values really are, the things that we believe about bringing volunteers into the library, that they do have sort of that unique qualification, that they are community members that want to serve other community members, that they're not just you know, there to do the grunt work and shelve books, that they have an important role to play. We want to make sure that we're thinking about how we can echo that in our recognition. So if you're thinking about culture with regards to recruitment and creating a space for volunteers in your library, really making sure volunteers have clearly defined roles and appropriate training and support to do their work. We want to take that to the next step and make sure that recognition is based in those things that we value and the things that we believe about the work that volunteers bring to your libraries. So really thinking about the real impact of volunteers on your libraries and your patrons, thinking about the value that volunteering brings to our volunteers, that way to get involved, that way to help people. I'm not sure if all of you are on the listserv, but Carla shared a great article about a library in Bisbee, Arizona, and sort of how the community rallied around this library and was able to provide services to people that were no longer getting services because of budget cuts and things like that. And it was just super inspiring. And that's the kind of impact, that's the kind of recognition we want our volunteers to know. Sort of how did you play a role in making sure the community was served? So sometimes we just count up those hours and we might we might make that sort of an equivalent of a full-time staff person. So oftentimes you hear that, oh, we got 2.5 full-time staff people worth of volunteer time. That's not really the real impact of volunteers on your organization. How many story times was that? How many hours in the computer lab? How many searches to help somebody find a job is included in those 2 full-time equivalent volunteer hours? Full-time employee equivalent volunteer hours. We also sometimes look at recognition with regards to sort of that dollar value, right? That independent sector value. It can sometimes, again, put things in context for decision makers in our organization, but it's not necessarily the way volunteers want to be recognized, right? If somebody said to me, oh, thank you so much for giving, us 3 hours today, that's the equivalent of $75 worth of paid staff time, I might feel a little bit diminished. I'm not coming to replace paid staff. I'm not counting my volunteer impact in dollars. So we really do want to start to think about how we can help volunteers understand what kind of a real contribution they're making. And sometimes they see that, particularly if they are working with patrons, if they are sort of participating in those opportunities that allow them to interact with the public and help them find what they're looking for or feel comfortable on the computer, or certainly see those little faces light up when they hear a good story. But for all our volunteers who maybe don't have such an obvious connection to patrons or to the community, we want to make sure that we are arming them with recognition that's meaningful to them and that matches their motivation and helps them understand their contribution. So what does it mean if those books do get sort of reshelved in the right way versus the wrong way? Those volunteers that are doing book repair, those volunteers that are bringing their professional level skills in planning community events or translating materials into other languages, what's the impact of that? And how can we help our volunteers understand that? And how can we help them tell their story, which is really what we want to do. Again, that great survey that goes out asking, what have you done? Have you told a friend or a family member or a coworker about services at the library? We want them to embellish that with the great impact that they know they're making. I've been volunteering in this capacity and I've been able to help this many people or make this kind of an impact or, allow us to sort of keep in circulation this many books, or I've reached this many people with my translated materials. We really want them to be able to put their value in our organizations in context, and that's not about being a part of a full-time staff member equivalent or a dollar value that's sort of assessed from a sort of nationwide perspective. So you might be starting to think about how that might work in your library or what that might look like. Next slide, please. So, meaningful recognition. And again, everybody's going to come with something slightly different. For example, at Volunteer Match, we've had a volunteer who's been with us for over a decade, longer than I've been at Volunteer Match. And she is amazing. She goes above and beyond on a regular basis. She understands the historical context. She understands sort of the intricacies of what it's like to use the tool from a nonprofit perspective. She never wants to be recognized in front of the organization, right? If she feels put on the spot, she feels like that's not what she's volunteering for. But there are other things that I can give to her, or ways that I can recognize her work, including inviting her to be part of decision-making opportunities, giving her the opportunity to share her expertise and to have a voice as Volunteer Match evaluates what's working and what's not working. So even trying to throw just sort of a celebration of how long she's been there and how much work she's done, it isn't something she wants, but a note plus being invited to participate and having real decision-making authority within the work that she's doing is how she feels recognized and valued in the organization. So when we think about meaningful recognition, it may not be the same thing for everyone. We want to make sure that it is personalized and heartfelt. And again, the larger our volunteer core is, the harder that is. When you have a few dozen volunteers, it's easy to get to know them and to know sort of what they care about, what matters to them. When we get larger, when we have volunteers that are coming in for special events, we might need to sort of bucket people together. Here are volunteers that we know are looking for, you know, that direct impact. They want to know what they've done. Here are volunteers who are coming in who really want that individual connection and recognition from paid staff or from decision makers in the library. So really thinking about how you can streamline some of those actions without making it feel sort of interchangeable, right? And like volunteers are cookie cutters. We want to try to individualize, again, as much as possible, that individual value that a volunteer brings to your organization. Now, if we have a dozen volunteers doing story time, we can probably make some of those statements a little bit more sort of sweeping, generalized, but again, there is real value in saying, gosh, you know, at the end of that story time, you always do such a great job of finding the right book for these kids, and they really appreciate the energy that you bring to it so that it feels personalized in the moment. We're also going to talk a little bit today about making sure that this is something that you can do on an ongoing basis and something that doesn't require a heavy lift every time you need to recognize someone. So if you are only recognizing volunteers once a year because you have to pull everything out of a database or compile everything, we want to switch the way that we're thinking about that so that it feels authentic. And that we are, as much as possible, trying to make that feel individualized to that volunteer. While also, of course, tying it to the mission of your library, to the patrons, what they're getting from the work that volunteers are doing, whether that's direct services or if that's more behind the scenes support. And again, thinking about that culture, the things that the goals that we have around volunteer engagement, our values and our beliefs around volunteer engagement. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this slide, not every volunteer is going to want a thing, right? This doesn't necessarily have to cost money when we invest in our volunteers. There are things that we can do that don't have hard costs associated with them that can oftentimes be more impactful or more meaningful as a type of recognition. Certainly giving volunteers more responsibility, thinking about how as they start to master skills or build more of sort of a reputation in your organization, giving them that opportunity to step up, thinking about where professional development or ongoing training plays a role in recognition. So we're investing our time and our energy into them, making sure they have the skills that they need, giving them that decision-making authority or more accountability around the work that they're doing. These are things that are recognition-based activities as well, even though they, you know, don't necessarily fall into what we think of as traditional recognition. Certificates and T-shirts t-shirts and all of those things. There may be some volunteers who are just dying to get their hands on a t-shirt, but most often our volunteers are coming to us for the other things, the things that are less tangible. Although I have volunteered at book sales for the San Francisco Library, and let me tell you, being the first one through there and getting to pick, the best of those books is definitely something that's tangible that I enjoy as a volunteer. But those are the kinds of things that can be nice add-ons to the real personalized, heartfelt recognition that comes from understanding a volunteer's real value in your library and sort of matching that up with their motivation and the things that they care about. Next slide, please. So I did mention that we sometimes do have a culture that has traditionally focused on things like hours or years of commitment and service to the library. We don't want to just throw that away, right? And we do, as I mentioned, we may also still have volunteers moving forward that need to track their hours or want to track their hours. There are definitely some milestone-focused volunteers that are interested in knowing how many hours they've given to the library. And there may also be volunteers that need to do that for service learning or for community service, court-appointed community service hours. But the goal here is not to throw it away, but the goal here is to really think about how we can start to make hours tracking and sort of hours counting only part of our recognition strategy, right? That it's not our whole recognition strategy. So we're starting to think about how we can add impact to those hours. This many hours, what does that mean? How many story times? How many kids? How many hours in the computer lab? How many books reshelved? And it's okay if it's an estimate. We do some of this with our volunteers at Volunteer Match as well. We can look at sort of who's done what with regards to the back end of Volunteer Match and the organizations that they've touched and the people that they've emailed, and we can pull together these numbers pretty easily. Again, we want to make sure that we're thinking about what this looks like. And if you do have to go into that database and pull things out into spreadsheets and put together pivot tables to try to figure out how many hours a volunteer has given to your organization, that's not necessarily something that's easy to do. It's not necessarily something that is going to pay off. So where can we start to think about impact that, again, can feel more personalized, but doesn't need to require so much of a heavy lift that we can't do it on a regular basis. And that's sort of one of those pieces, right? So we may have that annual celebration where we talk about hours and pass out certificates and give out awards, but we want to make sure that we're balancing that out with that individualized, personalized recognition on a regular basis. If we're talking about hard costs, note cards, not too expensive. We can make sure that volunteer supervisors, whether they're paid staff or volunteer staff, have a supply of these so that they can just dash off a quick note. It shouldn't take more than a few minutes, and it shouldn't feel so sort of much of a burden that people aren't able to do it quickly. Don't make them big, make them those sort of small ones that they, are just a couple of inches. So they don't have to write a whole novel. It's just a couple sentences of, thank you so much for stepping up today, for coming in at the last minute, for taking on this leadership role. I really appreciate you putting out this fire, whatever that looks like. And that's a really nice, easy way to create those personalized recognition moments on a regular basis. Again, we're not waiting 9 months to say thank you. We're saying thank you in that moment. Certainly verbally, if we see our volunteers face to face, or shooting off, again, quick notes, recognition, even if it's a personalized email, I still think it's nice to write something down on paper and put a stamp on it, because we don't get very much good stuff in our mailboxes. But this can be, again, a really easy way, and we can tap into others to do this. This doesn't have to fall only on our shoulders. That we have the opportunity to have the people who are supervising volunteers or interacting with volunteers. There are also great ways to bring patrons and clients into this. those computer lab patrons who are able to find a job or get an interview. Everybody loves those great drawings that kids make of, you know, thank yous and clouds and smiling suns and all of that kind of good stuff. These things are really can mean a lot more than the things that we count up once a year, or the sort of things that we might buy for a volunteer. Moving forward, we want to make sure that we are steering our volunteer towards the new goals, that we are thinking about how we can start to minimize some of that hours counting. Again, we don't want to just throw that away for our volunteers who are invested in it, but we want to make sure that we are thinking about how we can incorporate more impact. All right, and so I did want to stop just about halfway through here and see if there are any questions, or if anybody has examples from their library that they want to share. So I know, Donna, we can have people either type those in if there's questions, or people are welcome to unmute themselves. Maybe Donna needs to unmute herself. I'm not sure if we have any questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat box, but I hear someone ready to share something.
Hi, this is Sue in Idaho. I work with the Talking Book Service, and we use a lot of volunteers in narrating and monitoring books. And one of the things we do when a narrator and a monitor are done recording, we offer them to take those books if they'd like them. It's just a small way of saying thank you. They probably have written in the books. They've got some good memories and maybe some laughs about things when they were narrating them. And so we just make that offer to them, and quite often they take us up on it.
That's great, Stu. Have you ever thought about having the staff and others sort of sign those, write those notes in there so that it has sort of not just a personal connection, but sort of that thank you from the library?
No, but I thought of it now. I'll go ahead and work on that. Thanks.
That's something I've done with volunteers in the past. It's, you know, especially if there is a book that has become valuable to them, or if they have, when I worked in the wildlife space, we would oftentimes give field guides that had been signed by their team or by paid staff, just saying thank you. Again, we think of those books as something we hold on to, right? And especially library volunteers. Many of them come to you because the library is an important place to them in their lives, and books are important to them, and that opportunity to put a book plate in or to write a little note, it can sometimes feel really special.
It looks like we do have a couple of comments if you want to go ahead and look at those, Jennifer.
Absolutely. So Lee from Caldwell Public, she gives her volunteers coupons to their bookstore as a thank you. Also great, right? Being able to select those books yourself. Oh, nice. Presidential awards given by the mayor from Page, Arizona. I think, is that the Points of Light? Maybe, I'm not sure exactly which award that is, but and that they also do notes after every event or program, which is a great idea too. Again, notes are really easy to do, and they're really easy to make personalized. Again, those nice small ones are sort of, I don't know, 3 by 5 folded in half or 5 by 6 folded in half. Don't require that feeling that you have to write a whole novel in there like a card would. And they can mean so much to our volunteers. Again, especially if it's mailed to them and it shows up with all of those flyers and circulars and things that we're not excited to get in the mail. To have a nice little note in there can really stand out. And it again, oh yeah, handwritten birthday cards, congratulations cards, of course, recognizing events, bereavement cards. Oh, great. How can we recognize adult volunteers that have special needs, nonverbal adults or adults who are deaf? That's a great question, and we'll get to some of this. Certainly, we can ask them what matters to them, what is something that we can provide that really recognizes the impact that they're making. I think for me, I'd want to sort of understand what the value is that they're getting out of the work in the library, and that might mean giving them some additional responsibilities or access, or sort of an idea that yes, Great Monterey writes in and says that many of the volunteers with special needs do like those physical things like certificates. So that might be a case where that certificate and that recognition, even if it's not fancy, is still something that carries some value and some pride for them. That's a great recognition opportunity. So Debbie was talking about the Presidential Volunteer Service Awards, that they have silver, gold, and those kinds of awards as well. Again, making sure that we're not just thinking about how we recognize those superstar volunteers, but how are we recognizing volunteers for.
Jennifer, you're starting to break in and out. I hope it's not because of the wind in California.
Somehow I got muted, so I don't know. Hopefully this is better.
Okay, yes, much better.
Okay, and making sure that we're not missing some of those smaller moments of recognition, right? While we want to think about how we can recognize our superstar volunteers, we do also want to make sure that we're not just waiting to recognize superstar volunteers, that we're recognizing all of our volunteers in a way that's meaningful to them. All right. The only thing I would say here, and you guys can keep typing in your recommendations or your suggestions, things that you're doing. Again, this is sort of a big picture thinking. We do want to be careful when we give out gift cards. They sort of fall into a gray area for the IRS. The IRS considers them sort of taxable income. So something like Rebecca mentions that she gives entry bracelets for local arts and crafts fair. That's a tangible thing that is not easily converted to cash. The IRS doesn't like gift cards because it feels like money to them, and that can start to blur the line between paid staff and unpaid staff. Technically, it would count as income for a volunteer, not that a lot of people are reporting that on their taxes, but the IRS thinks that they should. So just thinking about that, it's much better to give somebody something like a book or that entry to a community event, which is a great idea, rather than giving them that gift card. Even though that gift card feels like it comes with so much more flexibility, it can also sort of just blur those lines a little bit between paid work and unpaid work. All right, so let's keep going on the content, and we can do some review of, if you guys want to keep typing in your great ideas, we can share those at the end. So we've talked about a little bit of this, but as you think about your recognition strategy, where can you start to bring it towards that mission or the impact that volunteers have in your organization? Remembering that volunteers want to make a difference and volunteers want to find that cause that they care about. We want to make sure that they are learning how they're helping that cause. How are they helping the library? How are they helping the patrons, your community in general? So we've talked a lot about those personalized, heartfelt notes, thinking about how we can tap into patrons and visitors, staff, of course, paid staff and volunteer staff that are supervising volunteers, celebrating those accomplishments or those small wins. Sometimes it's going, taking one step above and beyond, or it's, digging through a big box of something or getting into that back closet and cleaning it out. Those kinds of things that sort of stand out to you, small wins for teams or committees that might have been working on something, getting all of those kinds of, again, not waiting for the end of something or the completion of something to say you did a great job today, whether that's, again, face-to-face, or if we have volunteers that, aren't necessarily, we're not seeing them on a regular basis, or they're sort of coming and going, working on their own time, dropping those notes in the mail or even an email can mean a lot. Again, thinking about how an individual volunteer participates and contributes. What do they bring? Again, we don't want our volunteers to feel like interchangeable cogs in a big machine of volunteering. We want them to know that they are uniquely qualified, even if they are uniquely qualified in a way that's similar to how other volunteers are uniquely qualified to participate and contribute to the library. So again, what is it? Their dedication? Is it something about how they approach the role, the skill set that they bring? That's something that you can point to that shows a volunteer sort of how they are personally contributing to that library. And again, thinking about the values. What are the things that your library says are important to you as a group, as an organization, around that mission, around the values of engaging volunteers, the things you prioritize, those goals or those beliefs? So if we say that we believe that volunteers are a strategic component to the success of our library, how are volunteers contributing to that every day? It's not just hours, right? It's that dedication for some of them. It's those special skills for some of them. It's the opportunity to be part of and contribute to something bigger than themselves that can oftentimes be very valuable to our volunteers. And we want to know, hey, if you're a great team member, if you are a joy to have around, if you always bring in delicious cookies and keep other volunteers' spirits up, that's important and that's valuable too. The other thing that we can start to think about here is how we can, again, invest in volunteers as a recognition strategy, thinking about leadership roles. We've talked about professional development or ongoing education, invitations to participate or invitations to sort of participate outside of the way that others participate in the library. Volunteers have a special connection to our library. Is there that opportunity to have behind the scenes access, initial access? If you have a great author coming in, is there an opportunity for volunteers to come and be part of that cocktail party that others might not be able to be a part of, or to extend invitations to volunteers to participate in a way that is special because of their relationship to your library, because of the contribution they make to your library. So thinking about those kinds of things, and this is a great way to ask your volunteers what they'd like. We don't need to guess. We don't need to be mind readers. We have the ability to absolutely invite them to sort of author their own recognition experiences, what matters to them. Again, if we have a lot of volunteers, we might need to get a sense of what buckets matter to what people. We have volunteers that want additional responsibility, and we have volunteers that want additional access, and we have volunteers who really just want those pictures drawn by the kids from story time. That means something to them. We can get to that opportunity to understand more of what they're looking for without sort of having to do hit or miss, and without having to guess. It's also a great opportunity to invite volunteers into your recognition strategy, especially if you do have a very diverse volunteer core, if you have volunteers working in a lot of departments, if you have volunteers sort of spread out all over the community, inviting volunteers to be part of this, whether those are team leaders or committee chairs, or whether that looks like recruiting a group of volunteers to actually think about recognition strategies, to put together that survey, to bring back recommendations. Of course, if we have volunteers that are helping recognize other volunteers, we still want to make sure that they get recognized. But for those of us who have a lot of volunteers spread out, managing sort of an overall recognition strategy and ensuring that volunteers who are driving that get recognized can feel a little bit more manageable than trying to individually recognize hundreds of volunteers. All right, next slide, please. So how do we go ahead and get started? As I mentioned, we have that opportunity to ask. We want to understand what's working and what we want to sort of keep doing. Again, there is value in holding on to some of those traditional recognition strategies if you have volunteers that are invested in them. We don't just want to say, oh, you've been working towards that 10,000 hour certificate. Well, we're not doing that anymore. Like, that doesn't feel fair. We don't want anyone to sort of lose out on their recognition milestone that they're working towards. I don't know how much of this is in some libraries, but we see this a lot with like museums. They're working towards their Ruby pin or whatever that looks like, and taking that away sort of as you're starting to approach the finish line is not our goal here. Our goal is to really understand how we can start to incorporate things that might be more meaningful to all of our volunteers and create that sort of recognition net that's catching volunteers that are just coming in for a single day event or are bringing their professional level skills or working behind the scenes. Not every volunteer opportunity is hour intensive anymore. When we think about those professional level skills, that time in the computer lab or maker events, that brings a whole different level of community engagement and patron engagement than shelving books for 4 hours every week. So we want to make sure that we are thinking about what's working and not just throwing things away. But when we think about moving forward, where are those opportunities? Again, asking them what they want to do, what's motivating them, what do they enjoy about coming to the library and volunteering. Again, you guys have some of that from your surveys. You can understand a little bit more about sort of what brings volunteers to your library and what they do afterwards, but how can you start to tie that into recognition? And again, thinking a little bit about individuals and an individual role that a volunteer plays and how that is an opportunity to create that small connection. So that, again, we're thinking about that net of catching people right at the end of something, at the end of story time, at the end of their shift, or at that small win or small accomplishment for a team or a committee, thinking about sort of those larger celebrations or larger recognition opportunities, and then thinking about where you can pull in others from your library, whether that's patrons or paid staff, and where you can say thank you in front of your whole community. And oftentimes we see these kinds of thank you messages go out on social media. They can be really powerful. They can really highlight the real impact of volunteers in your library and in the community. Oftentimes this can also be a nice passive recruitment message. Oh wow, I didn't know volunteers could do that. Sometimes we have opportunities to put together great videos or infographics, but sort of really thinking about where that culture, the goals that you have, the values around volunteer engagement within your library, the things that you believe about how volunteers support and sort of elevate the work of your library. How can we tie that into recognition? All right, I think we have one more slide. I've been talking about a lot of things today. So I know you guys have been doing a great job of sharing your examples. So we talked about a little bit of this as well, providing some of that access, leadership roles, training and skills building, pulling volunteers together, sort of a town hall or a state of volunteering in your state of the state address of what's going on with volunteering in your organization. What got done? How did that impact patrons, the mission of your library, the community, thinking about those open house opportunities. You have an opportunity for volunteers to bring their friends and family. There are some hard costs around that, having the lights on and maybe keeping security on for later, but inviting volunteers to bring their friends and family for after hours events at the library, sharing their favorite parts of it. Again, while there's some sort of passive recruitment here. Mostly this is about volunteers being allowed to tell their story of volunteering in a way that feels meaningful to them and in a way that they can show off what they do and share their pride in the work that they do at the library. Again, we want to make sure that this is easy and sustainable. We don't want recognition to feel like a heavy lift, and that's why we only do it once a year. We want recognition to feel like it's something that we can do on an ongoing basis. We can catch those small wins. We can have those sort of milestone celebrations, that we aren't waiting to celebrate the work that volunteers are doing for the right time or for the annual brunch, because we may not get all of our volunteers in that net. We want to make sure that the net's more like a fine sieve instead of a big, fishing net that things can get through. We can absolutely recruit others, whether that means tapping into team leaders or committee chairs and empowering them to recognize volunteers. We can think about how we might be able to recruit volunteers either from our existing volunteer corps or from outside to think about what recognition could look like, do some of those surveys, ask some of those questions. And what we can do when we look forward as we start to redesign, design new opportunities or redesign old volunteer opportunities or existing volunteer opportunities, that we start with impact. We don't want to scramble and have to think about, why does this volunteer opportunity matter? How does this volunteer opportunity help us? When we design our mission-driven volunteer opportunities, we start with impact first, not just what a volunteer is going to be doing, but why that matters and how that helps. We're sort of a little bit ahead of the game when it comes to recognition, because we can close that loop. Here's why this work matters, and here's how you did that work, or here's how you contributed to why that matters, which is makes it a little bit easier when it comes back around. All right. So I think we do one final slide for things to think about. Oh no, I'm sorry. Was there one more in there? Oh, nope, go back. There we go. So again, I get this question a lot. How much recognition should I be doing? How much is enough? How much is too much? I'm not sure that there's too much recognition. But again, we've talked today about making sure that we're creating that sort of series, that pyramid, if you will, of sort of the everyday small wins, thank yous at the ends of shifts, or small notes that say thank you. And then on top of that, we might have those celebrations within our library, celebrations with other volunteers, with paid staff, at the end of the busy season, at the end of the school year, the end of the summer, or whatever that looks like. And then on top of that, we might have those fewer, more sort of broad celebrations. Again, we had some great recommendations from awards that come from outside the library, community-based awards. We might do that big infographic or video celebrating the impact of volunteers that we share to our community, we put out on social media. So making sure that we're thinking about that triangle and how that works, and that we are really, again, making sure that those celebrations happen for team wins or accomplishments. When the community event program ends, we want to make sure all of those volunteers know how valuable they were. At the end of the book sale, we want to make sure those volunteers know what they've contributed and how they've participated. All right, now those things to think about, and I know we've got a lot of people typing things in that we want to share. Don't leave volunteers out of this process. Make sure you're asking, and especially when you are starting to onboard new volunteers, this is a great time to talk about what they're hoping to get, what they want to accomplish, how they want to know that they've made a difference. And start sort of keeping track of that in maybe a formalized way in a volunteer database or management system, or maybe just in a more informalized way, getting a sense of what's bringing volunteers to their library. Thinking about how we can incorporate new recognition opportunities into some of those existing pieces, right? So if we are doing certificates, if we are sort of counting hours, how do we start to also add in impact or invite others to participate to that? and again, as I mentioned, making sure that when we think about designing new opportunities or revisiting or sort of energizing our existing volunteer opportunities, that we're starting with that mission or the impact of that work, and thinking about sort of those professional level milestones as well. So if you do have volunteers that are bringing their professional level skills, what matters to them and how can we celebrate that? Because we do a certificate for a volunteer who's working on building their graphic design portfolio. It's probably not going to be as impactful as maybe a LinkedIn review or the opportunity to use the work that they've done for you in their portfolio. So again, sort of thinking about what feels appropriate. And honestly, the best thing to do there, again, is to ask, invite volunteers into that process. This doesn't have to be sort of magic or secret or a surprise. We want volunteers to sort of
How's everyone doing? Can you hear me? I lost Jennifer. Okay, great. Well, she had warned me that they had really terrible winds in California, and so she may lose power. So we're just going to wrap it up, talk about the resources that Volunteer Match has, which you can see there on the screen, but we also have the Get Involved Clearinghouse, which probably has a different link than the one she has there, but I bet you that one will get you there also, the getinvolvedca.org. So Carla says that Jennifer just wanted to say thanks for all your amazing support to our 4 states during this 3-year grant. You've been great. And so we are terribly sorry about the technical difficulties we had today, but it just wouldn't be a webinar without a few technical glitches. And we sure appreciate the work that you all are doing to support your communities by using the Volunteer Match resources as well as the Get Involved collaborative resources. So Carla posted the link there to the getinvolvedclearinghouse.org, and I will archive this webinar for all to enjoy and for you to share, and we hope you have a really great day.